Just to give you a little bit of history, I was a very strange little kid, clearly very stylish, very popular with boys. No, I was not. I was a nerd. I was a bird nerd. I was obsessed with bird watching, and I think, I look like I'm on safari here, but I'm at a zoo. So this is how cool I was. I dressed like this to go to the zoo. And my mom, bless her heart, actually, my mom's here tonight. And my pediatrician, Dr. Goldberg, is here as well. So he's known me almost as long as my mom, or I guess as long as my mom. He was there when I was born. So this is a little bit, coming home for me. I grew up in Marin County, and actually I worked in the cafe here at the Book Passage in the summers when I was in college. I was a barista. I made Isabel Allende her coffee drinks. I don't think I ever got her phone quite right, but I did serve her coffee. So anyway, I was obsessed with the idea of becoming a wildlife photographer. I always loved wildlife as a kid, and I was one of those strange kids that knew exactly what they wanted to do. I think my family thought I might grow out of it, and I never did. And so it's interesting for me because I don't know life that isn't completely centered around wild animals. I don't know what life would be like living that way. And it's always been a big focus from day one. So growing up in Marin County, I went to school at Boulder for a couple years, and then I went to Santa Cruz to finish. And there I really started working with local landscapes, but also started to work with species that I was lucky enough to live around, like harbor seals and sea otters. And this is the first time that I was really able to work with one subject in depth for a long period of time. So I would go out and photograph, let's just say harbor seals for an example, and I would do it every spring for 5 years in a row. And I really got to know that species intensively. And I started to understand that this wildlife photography thing is more about animal behavior than it is about the photography, which suited really well with me because I was most passionate about the wildlife and not the f-stops. And to this day, I find f-stops incredibly boring. And I have a love-hate relationship with my gear. I'm not a gear person, but it's a necessary evil. And I consider myself more like a wildlife watcher with a camera. And so what I'm most passionate about is being out there with these animals. In my early 20s, I got the opportunity to travel to Alaska and spent several summers working with brown bears in a place called Katmai National Park in the coastal section of it, which is very remote. This was my first time working with that sort of typical sexy megafauna that I had dreamed of since I was a kid. I dreamed of big cats and apes and bears. And this was also my first time working with an animal that could potentially kill you. And what I realized is that there's a difference between working with certain populations. And in this place in particular, in some places it's considered suicidal to go out and photograph, let's say, sows with their cubs on foot. But in this area, they've never been hunted before, and they have no reason to fear people. So I started to pick and choose my locations and my populations of the subject very carefully, and managed to stay very safe working with animals in situations where you basically shouldn't be in. And that became really important to me, was knowing number one, the population, but also knowing the behavior of the species that I'm working with. So for example, if you go out on safari and you see a lion and they yawn, they're yawning when they're fat and happy. If you see a grizzly bear yawn, they're most likely going to charge you very quickly. They yawn when they're stressed out. So I started to realize also too of, knowing an animal's behavior isn't necessarily just about being able to predict what they're going to do next in terms of getting a good photo. That certainly helps, but it also helps keep me safe while I'm out there. Worked with polar bears a bit, -50 conditions that, being a California girl were stretching my comfort zone a bit. And then going out with some polar bear biologists who were darting moms and cubs as they were leaving their dens. And this was a part of a significant global warming study where they started to see that the bears were going into their dens and leaving their dens less physically fit every year. Because of the breakup of sea ice, they weren't able to hunt and feed themselves properly, so essentially we're becoming skinnier and skinnier every year. And this is one of the studies that really showed that and proved that to the world. It was a 20-year-long study. And being out with these biologists, you have to cover yourself almost completely in conditions like -50. And then having a biologist say, can you hold this cub for a second and keep it warm? Yeah. No problem, I'll take her. So, incredible experiences working with scientists as well. And then also in my 20s, I went to get a job on a ship going down to Antarctica. I did 2 expeditions. And that was a fantastic experience for me. The first year I was the only girl on staff with about 12 guys. It was really serious physical labor, loading people in and out of Zodiacs, doing a little bit of Zodiac driving myself. But I got 2 hours a day. I think it was paid like $100 a day, something ridiculously small. But it got me to Antarctica, and it gave me I got 2 hours a day where I could shoot and photograph penguins for a month at a time. So this was an opportunity where I decided I wouldn't necessarily take that job now, but I took it then. But my big break, so to speak, came when I decided to pick up and leave my life at home and go to Africa. And the way it transpired is a bit of a long story, and I'll tell you the really short version. I was in my mid-20s, and I was working a day job. So wildlife photography is not the kind of career that you can just graduate from college and say, I'm going to be a wildlife photographer. It's a bit like saying, well, I'm going to be a rock star or a Hollywood actor. It just is incredibly competitive. It's a very, very difficult field to make a living in. The pay is not good. There's a lot of sacrifices you have to make, and you have to work really hard to start selling pictures. So I was smart enough to get a day job at the Santa Cruz SPCA. I was living in Santa Cruz, and I was the PR director, so not bad. It was better than making coffee drinks. No offense to Book Passage, it was a great job. But I got to hang out with puppies and kittens and write press releases on spay neuter and that kind of thing. So not a bad gig. But I had been in this day job for about 6 years, and I was selling pictures, but I wasn't making a living. I was feeling a little demoralized about that. I was dragging around $50,000 of credit card debt. And so that's another thing about being a wildlife photographer. The startup costs are insane, and there's no bank that's going to give a wildlife photographer a loan. They'll laugh you out of there. So for me, credit cards were like this gift from God. People say like, oh, I wonder how much interest you paid. It took me 12 years to pay that off. I don't want to know how much interest I paid. I'm happy not knowing. For me, I was just happy they would give me a card, and that I could go and buy this 500mm lens and pay for tickets to certain places and stuff like that. So I was dragging around this debt, had the day job, and then I had the bad boyfriend. I think every woman has a bad boyfriend at some point in their life, and that was my time to have a bad boyfriend. And I was with him, I was living with him, I was with him 7 years too long. We all do that, and I just decided I needed to make a change. And I was really, really wanting to make a change. And then I got an email from some friends that I had in the Serengeti who said there's a litter of cheetah cubs out. And I had said to them, I want to know, when you see a litter of cheetah cubs, I want to do a cheetah project, and I want to follow this litter as they grow up. And this email came binging into my inbox at the perfect time in my life where I desperately needed a change, so I just did it. And within about a week, I had dumped the boyfriend, drained the savings account, put everything I had in storage, and I was on my way to Africa. I wound up in the Masai Mara because that cheetah litter disappeared. I went to the Masai Mara. I thought I'd be there 2 weeks, and I wound up staying about 3 years.